The city never really sleeps, especially not Manhattan. From the floor-to-ceiling windows of my apartment on West 57th, I could see the endless pulse of yellow cabs, the glow of office towers, the neon reflections dancing over the Hudson. It was almost midnight, and I was still working, finalizing notes for a pitch meeting with European investors. Numbers were my comfort, predictable and loyal. Family, on the other hand, had never been that simple. The quiet hum of my laptop filled the room until a notification broke the silence. A text from my mother, Elaine Bennett. "Sweetheart, just wanted to remind you. Olivia's wedding is this weekend in Savannah. We thought you already knew." I stared at the message for a long moment, waiting for the part where she'd admit it was a joke. My sister's wedding. This weekend. And I was just finding out now. A small, hollow laugh escaped me. Of course. Classic Bennett timing. I opened my email, searching every folder. Inbox, promotions, spam, nothing. No invitation, no save the date, no message from anyone. Just silence. My heart thudded in that familiar rhythm of disbelief turning into realization. It wasn't a mistake. They hadn't forgotten. They'd simply chosen not to tell me. I called my mother before I could talk myself out of it. She answered on the second ring, her voice warm, and rehearsed the same tone she used with neighbors she pretended to like. "Claire, darling." "What a surprise. Aren't you up late?" "I got your text," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "Olivia's wedding. This weekend." A pause, then a nervous laugh. "Oh, did you not get the email?" "I thought we sent one out to everyone. Must have gone to your work address or something." "I checked," I said quietly. "There's nothing." She sighed softly. "Well, you've been so busy lately traveling all over the world with your hotels. We didn't want you to feel pressured. And you know how small the venue is? Seats are limited, and you're coming from New York, right? You'd probably be late anyway." There it was, the polite dagger she'd perfected years ago, delivered with a mother's gentleness sharp enough to bleed without leaving a mark. I swallowed the bitterness that rose in my throat. "I understand," I said finally. My voice didn't shake. It never did anymore. "That's my girl," she said, relief audible. "We'll send you pictures, okay, Wova you?" The call ended before I could decide whether to say it back. For a moment, I just sat there, phone still in my hand, the city lights blurring into white streaks through the window. My reflection stared back at me, calm, composed, completely detached. The kind of face you learn to wear after years of being the afterthought. I turned back to my laptop, typing Savannah flights into the search bar, though I already knew there wouldn't be one. No reservation, no ticket, no one expected me to come. The irony stung. My company, Bennett Hospitality, managed half the luxury hotels in the Southeast, and yet, apparently, there wasn't a seat for me in my own family. My fingers hovered over the keyboard before closing the laptop. I leaned back, eyes drifting toward the ceiling. It wasn't the first time they'd excluded me. The pattern was always the same, disguised as forgetfulness wrapped in good manners. My 30th birthday when they accidentally booked a family dinner without me. The Christmas I spent alone because there was no room at the house once Grandma moved in. Always a reason. Always my fault somehow. I'd stopped arguing years ago. You can't win a fight when the other side refuses to admit there's a war. The room felt colder suddenly, or maybe it was just me. I got up, poured myself a glass of red wine, and stood by the window watching the faint fog rise from the streets below. Somewhere down there, people were coming home from late dinners, from lives where family meant warmth, laughter, and a place at the table. I'd built an empire of places like that, suites, lounges, ballrooms, spaces where everyone belonged. Everyone except me. My phone buzzed again, a new email notification. Subject line invitation, Bennett family wedding. I clicked it open. The message was short, impersonal, sent from a generic event address. Dear Claire, we are pleased to confirm your optional invitation to the wedding of Olivia Bennett and Ethan Lawson to be held at the Grand Ballroom Savannah, GA. We apologize for the late notice. Kind regards, Harbor Light Event Management, sent at 8:45 p.m. The same night my mother texted me. Sorry for the late notice, I whispered, reading it aloud. The words blurred into a dry laugh that didn't sound like me. I set my wine glass down carefully, afraid of how steady my hands were. That steadiness was always a bad sign. It meant something inside me had clicked into place. For years I'd been the quiet one, the reasonable one. The daughter who didn't make scenes, But sitting there staring at that email, I felt a shift. Not anger, not even pain, just clarity. They'd built their table and decided there was no seat for me. I looked out at Manhattan again, the skyline burning gold against the dark. Maybe it was time to remind them who I'd become while they weren't looking. And this time, I wouldn't need an invitation. Morning sunlight poured through the glass walls of my office, painting thin gold lines across the marble floor. The city below was already alive. Taxis, honking people, rushing life, moving forward like it always does. Inside, though, everything felt frozen. My coffee had gone cold an hour ago, untouched beside a stack of reports that suddenly seemed irrelevant. On the far corner of my desk sat a silver picture frame I hadn't really looked at in years. 2 little girls in matching sundresses stood in the backyard of our old house in Boston. Olivia's arm was looped through mine, both of us grinning at the camera. I remembered that day. She'd been terrified of the sprinkler, so I'd stood beside her until she laughed. Back then, she used to call me her best friend. I turned the frame face down. Somewhere along the way, being her sister had turned into being her shadow. The sound of my heels echoed as I crossed the office, trying to shake off the heaviness in my chest. But memories came uninvited like they always do, my father's voice steady and condescending. Olivia's so friendly, she makes everyone feel comfortable. You should be more like her. My mother's softer but equally cutting tone. Claire, you don't have to prove you're the smartest in the room. It's not attractive. And then the day I got my acceptance letter to Harvard, I'd come home with tears of joy, waving the envelope like a trophy. My father barely looked up from the newspaper. That's great, sweetheart, he said. Just don't let it go to your head. People don't like arrogance. That was the thing about growing up in my family. Pride was fine for everyone else, just not for me. Every accomplishment, every step forward came with an asterisk. You're impressive, but don't make us uncomfortable. I sat down at my desk and opened my laptop. The screen lit up with a cascade of unread messages, business inquiries, booking reports. The routine steadied me. It always did. Work was simple. Numbers, contracts, results. No emotions, no judgment. I was halfway through approving a new partnership proposal when a soft knock came at the door. Grace Langford stepped in her presence, calm as ever. She'd been with me since the early years part, mentor, part friend, the only person who could read me without words. Her tailored gray suit matched the silver streaks in her hair, and her tone carried that deliberate stillness of someone who'd already seen every storm. You look like you didn't sleep, she said, setting a folder on my desk. I didn't, I admitted. She took the chair across from me. Family. I nodded. My mother called. Turns out Olivia's wedding is this weekend. In Savannah. Grace raised an eyebrow. And you just found out now, last night. She studied me for a moment, fingers lightly drumming on the armrest. You don't have to say it. I can already see the look. What look? The one you get when you're trying not to feel something. A faint smile tugged at my lips. You know me too well. She leaned forward slightly. Don't be angry, Claire. Be curious. Ask yourself what they're afraid of. I met her eyes. They're afraid I'll outgrow them. That I already did. Grace nodded slowly, her expression softening. Then stop asking for a seat at their table. Build your own. For a long moment I said nothing. Her words landed the way truth often does. Quiet, heavy, undeniable. I already did, I murmured finally. And somehow they still pretend not to see it. Grace smiled faintly, rising to leave. Then let them stay blind. Some people don't deserve the view. After she left, the office felt too quiet again. I turned to my computer, trying to distract myself with something tangible. The operations dashboard for Bennett Hospitality filled the screen. A live system showing occupancy rates events and pending contracts across all 17 properties. Routine comforted me. I scrolled through upcoming events, corporate conferences, charity galas, private weddings. The list was endless. My eyes stopped on one new reservation flagged in gold, an exclusive booking for the grand ballroom at our Savannah resort, managed by an outside event company, high-profile full buyout. The client's name caught my attention. Harborlight Event Management. It sounded vaguely familiar. Curious. I clicked open the details. The deposit was recent. The timing aligned perfectly with the weekend ahead. My stomach tightened as I skimmed further down. Under private client reference, there was a short line written in neat administrative font. Client Bennett family wedding. For a few seconds, I just stared at the screen, letting the words sink in. Then I read them again, slower this time, as if repetition might change what they meant. My own family, my sister's wedding, hosted in one of my hotels, booked through a third party so they wouldn't have to deal with me directly. A laugh bubbled up in my throat, sharp and humorless. Of course, they'd gone out of their way to pretend I didn't exist, only to end up paying for a space that literally had my name on it. I leaned back in my chair, heartbeat steady but quickening in my ears. The irony was almost poetic. I thought of Grace's voice still echoing in my mind. Stop asking for a seat at their table. Maybe I didn't need to. Maybe the table was already mine. I glanced at the framed photo again, the one of two little girls in a backyard that no longer existed. Olivia's hand in mine, the same trust, the same innocence. Somewhere between that picture and this moment, they'd decided I didn't belong. But I'd learned something from years of being left out. Silence can be a weapon sharper than any word. My cursor hovered over the reservation management tab. One click, and I could see every access code, every staff assignment tied to that event. I exhaled slowly, a small, knowing smile curving at the edge of my mouth. Well, I whispered to the empty room. Looks like I finally got an invitation. And for the first time since last night, the thought didn't hurt. It intrigued me. By the time Marcus knocked on my office door, the city had already settled into its mid-morning rhythm. Sirens in the distance, the hum of elevators, the low chatter of assistants passing in the hallway. He entered carrying a thick stack of folders, his expression tight the way it always was, when he'd uncovered something I needed to see immediately. Morning, he said, closing the door behind him. You're going to want to look at this. I gestured to the desk. That's never a good opening line. Marcus laid the folder down in front of me. Savannah, Grand Ballroom. The weekend booking you flagged, fully confirmed under Harbor Light Event Management. I skimmed the first page, recognizing the format of our third-party event contracts. They've paid in full. He nodded. Deposits cleared yesterday. All documents list Harbor Light as the contracting client. On the surface, it's a routine full buyout. But take a look here. He pointed to a section marked Client of Record. My eyes scanned the line, and there it was again. Bennett family wedding. I felt something flicker inside me, a mix of disbelief and bitter amusement. My family booked their event through a middleman to host it at one of my hotels. I said, almost laughing. You can't make this up. Marcus folded his arms, the corner of his mouth twitching in restrained disbelief. They really don't know, do they? Of course they don't. I tapped the edge of the folder. The ownership paperwork only lists the Bennett Hospitality Group. They've never understood that's not some nameless corporation. It's me. He hesitated before saying quietly. That must sting. I looked up at him. It's funny, actually. They've spent their whole lives trying to keep me out of their world, and now they're paying to stand inside mine. He exhaled slowly, half a smile breaking through. That's poetic in a twisted kind of way. I leaned back, feeling the cool leather against my shoulders. You think so? Because to me it feels like karma, just sent an RSVP. Marcus chuckled. Then his tone shifted back to professional. So what do you want to do? We can flag the reservation, have the management team. No. I cut him off. Not yet. I want everything to proceed exactly as planned. No changes. No warnings. He nodded, reading my expression. Understood. When he left, I sat in silence for a long moment, staring at the folder. The Bennett family wedding. It looked so official, so detached. But behind those sterile words were the same people who once told me I made them uncomfortable by being too ambitious. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the name I needed, Daniel Foster. My attorney, the one person who knew the full story of how I'd built this company and what I'd nearly lost in the process. He picked up on the second ring. Claire, I was just about to call you about the Singapore contract. Not Singapore, I interrupted. Savannah. He paused. Ah. The family wedding I've been reading about in the society section. I let out a humorless laugh. That's the one. They booked the event at my resort without realizing who owns it. That's ironic. I need you to verify something for me, I said. Under the 2018 ownership restructuring, I still hold full operational control, correct? Including authority over third-party events. Daniel's tone grew serious. Yes, you do. Clause 17, Section 2. You can suspend or modify any event in your properties if it threatens brand integrity or safety. Why? Just confirming. I said, let's call it due diligence. He chuckled softly. Claire, I know that tone. What are you planning? Nothing illegal, I said, smiling faintly. Just something overdue. There was a pause on the line before he said, whatever it is, make sure it's worth it. Oh, it will be. When the call ended, I stayed still for a moment, phone in hand, as an old memory surfaced, the kind that always came uninvited. It was 2018, the year everything shifted. I was 29, exhausted, running the company from a corner desk in a borrowed office. My father had come to see me, still dressed like the high school principal he used to be, tie perfectly knotted eyes full of condescension, masked as concern. Claire, he'd said, you're too young to manage something this size. Let me hold some of the shares just temporarily for the family's protection. I'd been naive enough to sign the papers he placed in front of me. 40% transferred to him for the good of the Bennett name. Within months, he'd started using it as leverage, calling board meetings without me rewriting company statements to downplay my role. It took 2 years a legal battle, and Daniel's relentless work to undo the damage. When I finally regained full control, I promised myself no one would ever have that kind of power over me again. Not even the people who shared my last name. And now, here they were walking right back into my world, without even realizing it. I flipped the folder closed and stared out the window. The Manhattan skyline glimmered in the distance, sharp and cold, like the edge of something beautiful and dangerous. This wasn't about revenge, I told myself. It was about perspective, letting them see what they'd tried to bury. I pressed the intercom button. Marcus. He answered immediately. Yes, Claire, book me a flight to Savannah, I said. Tomorrow morning. Keep it under my initials only. And don't tell anyone where I'm going. There was a brief pause. Understood. Should I inform the resort manager? No, not yet. I looked again at the framed photo I'd left face down earlier. I want to see firsthand where they plan to seat me. As I ended the call, the office lights dimmed automatically, a timed energy saver. The city outside flickered in reflections across the windows, each building a mirror of the life I'd built from scratch. And somewhere in Georgia, preparations were underway for a celebration that had already decided I didn't belong. A small smile formed as I whispered to the empty room. We'll see about that. The wind at JFK carried that unmistakable chill of early spring, cool enough to make you pull your coat a little tighter, but not cold enough to bite. I wheeled my small suitcase through the terminal, a single beige trench coat draped over my shoulders, heels clicking against the polished floor. My entire life fit neatly into that carry-on. One tailored suit, a folder of legal documents, and just enough resolve to get me through the next 48 hours. The boarding area buzzed with noise. Families juggling strollers, business travelers glued to laptops, couples already leaning into vacation mode. I found a seat by the window, watching as the afternoon light slid across the tarmac. The reflection caught the silver face of my watch. The one I'd bought for myself the day I took back control of my company. A small reminder of survival disguised as luxury. As I waited for boarding, I scrolled through old texts from my mother. Each one followed the same rhythm. We're so proud of you, sweetheart, but you work too much. But don't brag. But family comes first. There was always a but, always a quiet reminder not to shine too brightly, not to outgrow the box they built for me. The flight was delayed 20 minutes. I ordered a black coffee, the kind that burned just enough to keep me sharp, and stared at the departing planes. People were boarding their next chapters, moving toward something. I wasn't sure what I was moving toward. Closure, maybe? Or proof that I didn't need any. When we finally took off, the city below looked like a constellation of everything I'd built and everything I'd left behind. The plane cut through clouds as I closed my eyes, half dozing. Every now and then my mother's voice would echo in memory. You're so serious all the time, Claire. My father's too. A good daughter doesn't need to prove her worth. I could almost laugh at how deeply those words had carved themselves into my bones. But now the ache wasn't sharp anymore. It had dulled into something heavier, a weight I could carry without flinching. 2 hours later, we descended into Savannah. Warm air pressed against the windows as sunlight flared off the river and a soft haze hung over the marshlands. The air smelled different here. Sweet, thick, faintly floral, like the world moved slower on purpose. As the plane taxied to the gate, I noticed lavender blooming in clusters along the runway. It felt almost theatrical, this calm before confrontation. By the time I reached baggage claim, Marcus had already texted. Checked in. Everything ready. Meet you at executive entrance. When I stepped outside, the heat wrapped around me like a memory of summer. A black sedan waited at the curb, and Marcus stood beside it, sleeves rolled up, tablet in hand. He looked like a man who'd already cleaned up 3 messes before breakfast. You made good time, he said, taking my bag. I didn't want to give them any more of it, I replied, sliding into the car. He chuckled under his breath as he climbed in beside me. They arrived an hour ago. Did the full tour of the ballroom, the garden terrace, the bridal suite. They looked pleased. I turned my head toward him. Pleased. He nodded. Your mother even complimented the floral arrangements. She said they felt exquisite, but not pretentious. A laugh escaped me before I could stop it. She has no idea she's complimenting her own daughter's taste. I'd say that's poetic justice, Marcus said. Poetic, maybe, I murmured, but not justice. Not yet. The car pulled onto Bay Street, lined with oaks draped in Spanish moss. Through the window, the city unfolded. Brick sidewalks, wrought iron balconies, pastel storefronts. I'd loved Savannah the first time I saw it. It was genteel, but unapologetically old money, a place that pretended to be polite while hiding all its secrets behind magnolia blossoms. Maybe that's why my parents fit right in. We turned onto Riverfront Drive, where the Bennett Savannah Resort rose above the waterline, like glass catching fire in the sunset. The building shimmered with reflected light, sleek and modern, yet warm. Design I'd fought for when investors wanted something more traditional. My fingerprints were everywhere. The curvature of the facade, the scent of citrus and cedar pumped through the lobby vents, the marble imported from Florence. This is still my favorite property, Marcus said as the car stopped. Feels like you in every detail. I gave him a small smile. Then I hope they like me. They'll be living inside my taste for the weekend. The valet opened my door, greeting me with professional cheer. Welcome to the Bennett, Ms. Bennett. The use of my name caught the attention of a front desk attendant nearby, and Marcus immediately stepped forward, clearing his throat. Please keep that between us, he murmured to the staff. Not a word to the guests about ownership. The young man nodded quickly, understanding. I gave him a reassuring glance. You're doing fine, I said softly. Thank you. Inside, the air was cool and fragrant with orchids. Staff moved gracefully, finishing preparations for the wedding. Arranging linens, polishing silver, adjusting lighting. No one knew the family they were preparing for was mine. That anonymity was power, and I intended to keep it that way until the right moment. The elevator ride to the executive floor was silent, except for the faint hum of piano music piped through the speakers. Marcus tapped his tablet, scanning the day's schedule. Rehearsal dinner starts at 7 tonight. The full ceremony's tomorrow afternoon. Media check-in begins at 10. Any issues so far, I asked. None. Everything's running like clockwork. The family's staying in the presidential suite overlooking the river. I stared at the screen over his shoulder, a faint smirk forming. The suite I designed myself. Yes. Your father commented on how impressive the view was. Said the place has taste. I almost laughed again. Then he finally agrees with me about something. The doors opened to the executive floor. Marcus carried my bag to the corner suite, unlocking it with a keycard. You'll have full access to the operations hub from here. Staff's been instructed to report only to me. I nodded. Good. Tomorrow I'll handle it personally. He hesitated at the doorway. Claire, you sure about this? Once you walk into that ballroom, there's no going back to quiet. I looked past him at the window where the Savannah River glowed orange beneath the setting sun. Marcus, I said softly. I stopped being quiet a long time ago. They just never noticed. He gave a slow nod, setting the bag down before leaving. As I stood alone in the suite, I could hear faint laughter drifting up from the courtyard below, voices I knew too well. My family was down there basking in the illusion that I was still somewhere far away, too busy, too detached. I moved toward the full-length window, the glass cool beneath my fingertips. From here I could see the ballroom through the reflection of the water. Crystal chandeliers, white flowers, perfection. The lobby doors opened again below. For a split second I caught sight of my parents walking through hand in hand, smiling, as if the world belonged to them. At the reception desk, the front clerk looked up. His eyes met mine through the glass, as if sensing my gaze. I placed a finger against my lips, a silent gesture. He understood immediately. Welcome, Miss Bennett, he mouthed quietly. I smiled faintly and shook my head. Not yet, I whispered to myself. Tomorrow they'll know. By the time dusk fell, the resort had transformed into something out of a glossy magazine spread. Warm lights glowed through the tall glass windows, casting reflections on the polished marble floors. The faint sound of a string quartet tuning their instruments echoed through the grand hallway. It was the calm before the celebration, a kind of fragile perfection that only existed right before things fell apart. I slipped through a side corridor, staying behind the heavy velvet drapes that divided the main ballroom from the service passage. The scent of white roses mixed with the faint sweetness of the candles, arranged on each table. Everything was flawless. Every corner, every flower, every detail screamed elegance and money. My money. Through a small gap in the curtain, I watched them. My mother stood near the center of the room, gesturing at a group of florists, giving instructions with the confidence of someone who believed the world existed to execute her vision. Olivia was nearby, radiant in an ivory gown, her hair swept up in soft curls. She was laughing at something the wedding planner said. The sound was light, effortless, so different from my own laugh, which always came after a calculation, never by accident. And then there was my father. Richard Bennett, charming as ever, in his pressed navy suit, talking animatedly with Mayor Lawson, his soon-to-be in-law. They shook hands like old friends, two men proud of how well their lives had turned out. For a second, I wondered if my name had come up in their conversation, or if I'd been conveniently erased again. I took a careful step back to stay out of sight, and that was when it happened. A young waiter carrying a tray of champagne flutes nearly collided with me. His eyes went wide. "Good evening, Ms. Bennett?" The words slipped out before he realized what he'd said. I froze, and across the room my mother's head snapped up. Her gaze swept the ballroom, sharp and searching. The waiter went pale, lowering his tray, as if the glasses themselves might betray him. I stepped back into the shadows, pressing a finger to my lips. He nodded, frantically understanding. My heart pounded hard enough to feel it in my throat, but my expression stayed still. I'd had years of practice hiding reactions. From somewhere behind me, Marcus whispered. That was close. I exhaled slowly. Not close enough to matter. He gave me a skeptical look. "She almost saw you. She didn't, I said. Watching Elaine turn back to the florist, her momentary suspicion fading. Let them enjoy tonight. They think tomorrow will be perfect. Let them believe that one more night. Marcus hesitated, then nodded. Whatever you say. He slipped away to check the lighting crew, leaving me alone in the quiet corridor. I leaned against the wall for a moment, closing my eyes, letting the muted strains of music filter through. My pulse slowed. When I opened my eyes again, I saw Olivia stepping onto the stage area, turning slowly in front of the mirrors as the wedding planner adjusted the hem of her dress. She looked happy. Genuinely happy. And for an instant, something in my chest softened. None of this was her fault. She'd been raised to believe I was distant busy, maybe even disinterested. She'd never seen the strings being pulled. Still, I couldn't stop thinking how easily my parents had erased me from their narrative. Their golden child was getting married, and I was a ghost in the building that bore my name. A vibration buzzed in my coat pocket, my phone. A message from one of the hotel's assistant managers, FYI, payment from Harbor Light hasn't cleared in full. Missing final deposit. Should I contact them? I smiled faintly. Timing was everything. My thumbs moved over the screen. Do nothing. Don't contact anyone. Leave it exactly as it is. I'll handle it tomorrow. I slipped the phone back into my pocket just as a burst of laughter erupted from the main room. My father was telling a story again. Something about how he used to coach Olivia's soccer team when she was 12. Everyone laughed politely, including my mother. The sound grated more than I expected. There was an ease to it, a comfort that came from never being questioned, never being left out. For them, the world was still small, safe, predictable, and they were about to learn how fragile that illusion really was. I took one last look through the curtain. Olivia was spinning in her dress, her skirt catching the light. My mother clapped her hands, delighted. "You look perfect, sweetheart," she said. "Your sister would be proud if she could see you." If she could see you. The words sliced cleanly, even though they weren't meant for me. It was the same as every other time, spoken with affection, carrying the assumption that I wasn't there, that I'd chosen distance over belonging. Marcus returned, clipboard in hand. "Everything's on schedule. Staff knows to follow your lead tomorrow." I nodded. "Good. Let's not disturb them any more tonight." He glanced toward the ballroom. You sure you don't want to say something? She is your sister. I smiled without warmth. Tomorrow we'll say enough. We walked quietly toward the rear exit. The hallways glowed in soft amber light, the sound of the quartet fading behind us. Just before stepping out into the courtyard, I stopped. A massive pane of glass stretched from floor to ceiling at the end of the corridor, reflecting the ballroom behind me. I stood there for a moment, staring at my own reflection, still poised, composed, surrounded by the shimmer of the world I'd built. Through the glass, I could see a glimpse of the life I was never allowed to belong to my parents. Laughing the glitter of chandeliers, Olivia twirling in her gown. The picture-perfect family tableau. For years, that image had been my motivation. To be seen, to prove I was worthy of standing among them. Now it just looked like a mirage. I reached out, touching the cool surface of the glass, and whispered under my breath, "Enjoy the night. Tomorrow you'll finally see me." Then I turned and walked away, leaving the glow of the ballroom behind me, the reflection fading with every step. The morning light in Savannah had a different hue, golden and forgiving, as if the sun itself was trying to soften whatever came next. From my temporary office on the 12th floor, I could see the gardens stretching out below the white chairs, already set up for the ceremony, the catering team moving like clockwork. Everything was perfect. And it would stay that way, until I decided otherwise. On the desk before me, a cluster of monitors displayed the resort's internal systems, the audio grid security cameras, and the live broadcast feed that Savannah Daily planned to run on their website and social channels. Every camera, every microphone, every stream of data, mine to control. Marcus stood near the door tablet in hand, his usual calm edged with caution. Savannah. Daily has finished setting up the live feed, he said. Their crew will start rolling at 11. I've double-checked with the tech team. You have full administrative access to the stream. If you say cut, it all goes dark. I didn't look up from the screen. Good, I said quietly. When I give the signal, cut everything. No warnings, no explanations. He hesitated. Understood. But Claire, this will make headlines. You know that, right? I met his gaze steady. Some stories need to be rewritten in public. This is one of them. He nodded once, sensing the finality in my tone, and left me alone with the hum of the monitors. For a while, I just sat there listening to the faint rhythm of the resort waking up below, the clatter of breakfast trays, the distant laughter of guests, the murmur of staff checking final details. To anyone else, it was a beautiful morning filled with promise. To me, it was the calm before a reckoning. I picked up my phone and scrolled to Grace's name. She answered on the second ring, her voice still warm and measured even from hundreds of miles away in New York. Morning, sweetheart. I saw the pictures on the resort's social media. They're setting up for the wedding, aren't they? They are, I said, staring out the window. Everything's going exactly according to plan. Grace sighed softly. Tell me, Claire, what's the plan? Are you really going to get revenge by turning off the lights? A faint smile touched my lips. No, I'm not punishing them. I'm just reminding them where they're standing. There was a long pause on the line. You always did prefer quiet to chaos, she said finally. But don't mistake silence for peace. Sometimes it's just another kind of noise. I know, I said. But this isn't about noise. It's about balance. They took my seat once. Now I'm just taking it back. Grace's voice softened. Then do it your way. Just make sure you walk away afterward. I intend to, I whispered and ended the call. I set the phone down beside a crisp sheet of ivory stationery, embossed with the Bennett logo. A reminder of the empire I'd built from their dismissal. Picking up my pen, I began to write in slow, deliberate strokes. They said there was no seat for me. Let them stand in silence. The words looked almost elegant in ink, poised and calm, stripped of anger. I folded the note carefully, slid it into an envelope, and left it on the desk. For a few moments, I just sat there, staring at it. My hands were steady, but something inside me shifted. An odd stillness, not cold, not cruel, just final. It wasn't hate anymore. It was truth. A chime from my computer broke the quiet. An email from Daniel. Subject, legal confirmation, Savannah Event Authority. The message was brief, clinical, exactly how I'd expected. Per ownership contract, Clause 17. Section 2, you retain sole discretion over event operations. Suspension or alteration of activities under brand security or data privacy remains legally protected. Proceed at your discretion. DF. I saved the document in 3 locations. Hard drive cloud and a flash drive I slipped into my coat pocket. Old habits die hard. Outside a soft knock. Marcus again. The florist is finalizing the last arrangements he said as he entered. The ballroom looks incredible. They'll start testing the lighting in 30 minutes. Guests are already arriving in town. Good, I said. He hesitated before asking, do you want to see it? The setup. Not yet. He lingered, clearly uneasy. Claire, what happens when you walk in there, when they finally see who's really in charge? I looked at him, then really looked. His worry, his loyalty, the quiet question behind his eyes. What will you say to them? He asked softly. Nothing, I said. Nothing they'll understand without me saying a word. He studied me for a moment longer, then nodded. I'll make sure the staff's ready. The systems are synced to your signal. When he left, I turned back to the monitors. The ballroom camera showed the final touches being made. White lilies in tall glass vases, the aisle lined with candles, a gold arch glittering beneath chandeliers. The image flickered briefly as a technician adjusted focus, and for a heartbeat, I saw my own reflection in the screen. Half in light, half in shadow. It struck me how far I'd come from the girl who used to beg for approval. That girl had wanted a place at their table. This woman had built the table herself. I took a deep breath and closed the laptop. Outside, the sound of laughter carried faintly from the courtyard, my mother's voice among it warm and cheerful as ever. She didn't know I was already here, just 12 floors above, planning the moment that would silence her carefully constructed world. The clock on the wall read 8:17. 3 hours until the ceremony. I stood, smoothed the lapel of my suit, and slipped the envelope into the drawer of the desk. For a second, the sunlight caught the edge of the watch on my wrist, the same one that had reflected in the airplane window yesterday. It glimmered like a reminder. Time once taken always comes back around. I looked once more at the cameras, the ballroom filled with white and gold, and whispered to no one in particular. Let's begin. Then I turned off the monitors, leaving the room in quiet golden light. The chandelier lights shimmered like falling stars over the grand ballroom, scattering diamonds across the polished floor. Everything gleamed, crystal, silver smiles. A small orchestra filled the air with the soft swell of strings, the kind of music designed to sound effortless and expensive. From my vantage point in the control room above the ballroom, the scene looked like a movie I'd already seen 100 times. The perfect wedding, the perfect family, the perfect illusion. Guests floated through the doors in waves of perfume and laughter. Photographers snapped photos, and reporters from Savannah Daily moved between tables gathering quotes for their inevitable coverage of the event of the season. Sarah Kim, the lead reporter, was already interviewing Mayor Lawson, who stood near the floral arch, looking smug and self-satisfied. Down below, my father, Richard Bennett, took his place beside Olivia, my little sister, though little no longer fit. She looked breathtaking in her gown, her face glowing beneath the delicate veil. My chest tightened in an old reflex I hadn't felt in years. She was radiant, innocent, and completely unaware that the walls around her belonged to me. I watched as my father adjusted his tie and offered his arm. Olivia smiled, slipping her hand through his elbow, and the orchestra swelled as they began the walk down the aisle. The crowd rose in unison, the sound of chairs scraping the floor, blending into a single hush of admiration. On the monitors, my mother, Elaine, stood at the front of the room, tears glistening in her eyes. The proud matriarch, the picture of grace. I almost wanted to believe she meant it. Marcus stood behind me, headset on his eyes, flicking between the control screens. Everything's running perfectly, he said. The sound mix is clean. The lighting crew is ready. Savannah Daily's live feed just went live. Good, I said, my voice steady. Keep it that way. He glanced at me carefully. You sure you're ready for this? I didn't answer. Instead, I looked down through the glass at the ballroom. From up here, the chandeliers looked like constellations, the people below like tiny stars caught in orbit around my family. I used to want to be part of that light. Now, I only wanted to hold the switch. The ceremony began. The minister's voice echoed through the speakers. Gentle, warm, predictable. Vows were exchanged. Applause followed. Then came the clinking of glasses, the murmur of small talk, the sound of camera shutters flashing over and over. Everything unfolded exactly as it should have. Every cue hit on time. Every speech rehearsed. Perfection. I glanced at my watch. 5:27 p.m., the same time I'd once marked in my calendar weeks ago, thinking I might call to wish Olivia luck if I'd been invited. The irony wasn't lost on me. Below, dinner was being served. Waiters moved in synchrony, trays of champagne glinting under the chandeliers. My mother, ever the host, floated from table to table, collecting compliments like trophies. At one of the front tables, she leaned toward a woman in a sequined dress, her voice carrying just enough for the nearby microphone to catch. "Everything turned out so beautifully," she said with a satisfied smile. "It's such a relief there were no surprises." "Everything's gone exactly according to plan," her companion laughed. "It really is perfect, Elaine." She placed a hand dramatically over her chest. "You know, I was so nervous after all the delays, but it seems even our family can be on time for once. No one's running late this time." My father chuckled beside her, nodding in approval. The polite laughter that followed reached even my monitors. And there it was. The moment. The tiny, practiced cruelty tucked inside civility. A line meant to sound harmless to anyone else, but sharp enough to leave its mark on me. Marcus looked up from his tablet. "You okay?" I smiled faintly. Of course. My fingers brushed over the control panel hovering above the recording switch. The camera feed showed my mother's smiling face, her champagne glass lifted mid-toast. Click. The red light blinked on. Recording. On the screen, she continued, oblivious. "We're so grateful everyone could be here today," she said, her voice ringing through the microphone. "It means the world to us that our family is complete. My family. Complete." I felt something inside me settle. Steady, final. This wasn't rage anymore. It was gravity pulling everything into its rightful place. Marcus broke the silence first. "You're recording." "Yes," I said. "What for?" I didn't look away from the screen. For when they pretend they didn't mean it. He studied me for a moment, then nodded slowly. "You're calm," he said, almost surprised. "I've had years to practice." I leaned forward, watching as Olivia and Ethan took the floor for their first dance. She looked radiant, spinning beneath the soft light, her laughter carrying through the hall. For a fleeting second, I felt something close to peace. She deserved her happiness. It wasn't her fault. But then my gaze drifted to my parents, smiling, like the architects of perfection, so sure of their own narrative. Elaine lifted her glass again. "To family," she declared, "and to always finding room for the ones who matter most." That earned another round of polite laughter. I pressed the record button again, ending the clip, the image freezing on my mother's perfect smile. The sound in the room above dimmed, replaced by the low hum of the monitors. I stared at the frozen frame for a long moment before saying quietly, "We'll see how complete they feel tomorrow." Marcus didn't respond. He didn't need to. He knew the plan as well as I did. I leaned back in the chair, my reflection faint in the glass above the ballroom. Down below, the dance continued, applause rising and falling like waves. The orchestra swelled again, and from where I sat, I could almost feel the vibration of the music through the floor. I glanced at my watch once more. The minute hand crept past 5:30. "Perfection," I whispered. And for the first time that day, I smiled. Not because I was pleased, but because I finally knew what perfection cost. At exactly 5:40 p.m., the ballroom glowed like liquid gold. Every chandelier shimmered, every champagne glass caught the light. Laughter rippled across the tables as photographers jostled for angles, their flashes creating a staccato rhythm that matched the upbeat jazz playing from the live band. I watched from the far end of the mezzanine, invisible in plain sight. My earpiece crackled softly with Marcus's voice. "They're about to cut the cake. Everyone's watching. You ready, all?" "Always," I murmured. Down below, Olivia and Ethan stood side by side, hands intertwined over the silver cake knife. 3 tiers of fondant perfection towered in front of them, topped with a delicate porcelain couple that looked ready to dance. The crowd clapped. Cameras clicked. The band played a gentle flourish as the knife pressed through the first layer. And then, nothing. The music cut out. The hum of the microphones died mid-note. The chandeliers flickered once, twice, and then dimmed until the room fell into a strange, shimmering half-darkness. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The silence was absolute, the kind that prickled over skin. Then came the whispers. What happened? Is it a power outage? Check the generator. From my earpiece, Marcus's voice was steady, perfectly measured. We're on schedule. I'll handle the floor. Across the ballroom, the large projection screen above the stage, where the Savannah Daily live feed had been streaming, blinked once, and the image vanished. In its place, white text appeared against a black background. Signal lost. The murmur of confusion swelled, rippling through the guests like static. A few reporters scrambled to check their cameras. Sarah Kim, ever the professional, kept hers rolling, sweeping across the uneasy crowd. Then the main doors of the ballroom swung open. The soft light from the hallway spilled in first, framing me as I stepped inside. My heels clicked once against the marble, the sound echoing through the hush. Heads turned one by one, a wave of recognition spreading like a slow burn. I walked forward calm and unhurried, dressed in an ivory suit that caught the faint light, each movement deliberate. Marcus stood near the tech booth across the room. Our eyes met for a second. His nod was barely perceptible. The orchestra, silent, now sat frozen with their instruments mid-air. The wedding planner was whispering frantically into her headset, the color draining from her face. And then I saw them. My father standing tall beside my mother, confusion creasing his brow. Olivia still holding the cake knife, her smile faltering as realization dawned. My mother's hand tightened around her champagne glass until her knuckles went white. I stopped halfway across the ballroom, letting the silence settle heavy around us. Every camera lens in the room found me. Every breath seemed to pause. "Don't stop on my account," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the still air. "Please continue. Everything's so perfect." A few uneasy chuckles rippled, but they died quickly. I let my gaze sweep across the decorations, the gold-trimmed napkins, the crystal vases, the lilies perfectly arranged. A place this beautiful deserves appreciation. I continued softly. So elegant. So familiar. Perhaps because I designed it. Murmurs spread through the guests. Someone whispered my name. My father blinked, not quite processing what he was hearing. My mother's voice finally broke the silence, sharp and trembling. "Claire." What are you doing here?" I took another step forward, my heels striking rhythmically against the marble. Attending my sister's wedding. Isn't that what family does? Olivia's eyes darted between our parents and me. "Claire, But I lifted a hand, gently stopping her. "It's all right, Olivia. You don't have to explain." My tone softened as I met her gaze. "You look beautiful." Her lips parted, but no sound came. Ethan put an arm protectively around her, clearly unsure what to do. I turned back to my parents. "I almost didn't recognize this place," I said. "It's changed so much since the last time I saw it. But then again, I suppose everything looks different when you've spent years pretending not to see it." My father stepped forward, his voice low but firm. "Claire, whatever this is, we can discuss it privately." "Privately," I repeated, smiling faintly. "You've kept things private for years. My absence, my success, my name. But this isn't about secrets anymore." Elaine finally found her words. Though they came out strained. "You're causing a scene." "No, Mother," I said evenly. "You caused the scene the day you told me there was no seat for me. I'm just walking into it." A gasp moved through the crowd. The silence thickened again, all eyes shifting to my mother. Her lips parted, a protest forming, but nothing came out. From across the room, Marcus pressed a discreet button on his tablet. The screen behind the stage flickered back to life, not the live broadcast, but a loop of images from the resort's grand opening ceremony 5 years earlier. My face filled the frame as I cut the ribbon, my name spoken in applause by a crowd of investors. Bennett Savannah Resort, founded and owned by Claire Bennett. The logo glowed in gold. I let the moment stretch the truth, finally catching up with them in real time. Olivia's voice was small. This hotel belongs to you." I nodded, every inch. The ballroom fell into stunned quiet. Even Sarah Kim, who had kept her camera trained on me, lowered it slightly as if sensing this was no longer just a news story. It was something raw, human, irreversible. I took one last step forward until I stood in front of the head table. My mother's hand trembled against her glass. I met her eyes. "Well, Mom," I said softly, "I suppose there's no problem with seating anymore, is there?" For a long, suspended moment, no one breathed. The chandeliers shimmered faintly, the sound of the river outside whispering against the silence. And then, somewhere in the back of the room, a glass slipped from someone's hand and shattered against the floor. No one moved. Sarah Kim slowly lifted her camera again, eyes wide, realizing she was capturing the story of the year. I stood there, the still point in the storm I'd built calm and absolute. And from the corner of the room, Marcus gave me a silent nod. Everything was exactly as planned. The silence that followed was unlike anything I'd ever heard. Heavy, charged. You could almost feel the oxygen thinning in the room as everyone struggled to decide whether to look at me or at my mother. The chandeliers flickered once before stabilizing their light, returning in a steady golden glow. Musicians sat frozen with their instruments half raised, unsure if they should resume or leave the stage. The scent of champagne and lilies hung thick in the air. And in that suspended moment, every eye in the ballroom was fixed on me. My mother was the first to move. Her practiced smile faltered but didn't completely disappear. She straightened her shoulders and began walking toward me, heels clicking across the marble. "Claire," she said, her tone trembling but still coated in civility. "Why don't we step outside? This isn't the time or the place for—" I cut her off, my voice calm, clear. "You once told me there wasn't room for me, but you seem to have forgotten Mother. You're standing in my hotel." The words hung there slow and deliberate. A few gasps rippled through the crowd. Elaine blinked, her mask of composure cracking for the first time. "Your hotel," she echoed. "What are you talking about?" I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I let the words settle my gaze, sweeping across the rows of guests who'd gone utterly still. Forks frozen mid-air. Champagne glasses trembling slightly in their hands. Olivia turned toward me, confusion clouding her expression. "Claire, I don't understand. Are you saying—" I looked at her gently. "Yes. This building, this resort, every floor, every chandelier, every brick that holds this place together, it belongs to me." My father stepped forward, then his voice low and sharp. "Enough." The tone that used to silence me as a child still carried weight, but now it rolled off me like water. "You're making a spectacle of yourself," he said. "And of us. This is your sister's wedding, not some stage for your ego." I met his stare without flinching. "No, Dad. I'm not here for ego. I'm here for the truth. You taught me to value honesty, didn't you? I'm simply showing everyone what you've worked so hard to hide." His jaw tightened. "You're embarrassing your family." I tilted my head slightly. "I'm not embarrassing anyone. I'm revealing them. There's a difference." The crowd murmured, shifting uneasily. At one of the back tables, Sarah Kim adjusted her camera-red light, blinking as she captured every word. Her instincts were sharp. She knew this wasn't a simple family argument. It was something larger, the kind of story that rewrote public perception. Elaine's voice rose again, strained but desperate to control the room. "Claire, please. People are watching. They always have been." I said softly, "You just didn't want them to see me." A hush fell again, the kind that presses down on your chest. My mother's painted smile dissolved completely now, leaving only the faint tremor of realization beneath her expression. I turned toward Olivia. She looked small in that moment, lost her hands trembling slightly as Ethan hovered protectively behind her. "Don't worry," I said gently. "This isn't about you. You deserve your day. The lesson today isn't for you to carry." Her eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. "I believe you," she whispered. That small act of kindness was enough to steady me. Behind me, Marcus stood near the tech booth waiting, watching for my signal. I caught his eye. The hum of the monitors flickered in my peripheral vision. The reporters had stopped whispering. The waitstaff had frozen near the walls. Every person in the room now existed in a single, fragile pause. Richard's voice broke the stillness. "You think this makes you powerful? Owning a building doesn't change who you are. You're still our daughter Claire." For the first time that night, I smiled, a quiet, unhurried smile that carried no triumph. "You're right. I am your daughter, the one you underestimated." He started to reply, but I lifted my hand palm outward. "Enough," I said softly, almost kindly. "Let's stop pretending." I turned to Marcus, my voice level. "Cut everything." He pressed the button without hesitation. The room plunged into stillness. The orchestra lights went dark. The microphones muted, the monitors blinked off one by one. Even the air conditioning seemed to stop, leaving only the faint sound of breathing, quick and uneven. The chandeliers dimmed to a soft glow, turning the ballroom into a stage lit by quiet revelation. In that silence, you could hear the truth settle. No announcements, no excuses, no defense. Just the awareness that every guest in that room now understood who truly held control, not just over the hotel, but over the story itself. Elaine looked around, lost for words. Richard lowered his gaze. Olivia stood still, her hand pressed against her chest, eyes shimmering with understanding. And me. I stood at the center of it all, unshaken, the calm, in a room that had finally run out of lies. For the first time in years, the silence didn't hurt. It felt earned. The ballroom was mine. The moment was mine. And somewhere deep down, I knew they would never forget it. By the time the last guests slipped out into the humid Savannah night, the damage had already been done. The story broke before midnight. My phone buzzed on the nightstand like a live wire, texts, calls, notifications stacking faster than I could swipe them away. Sarah Kim had posted her video first, a 2-minute clip that spread across social media like gasoline catching fire. The caption read, "TEO Claire Bennett appears unannounced at her sister's wedding, held in the luxury hotel chain she owns." It wasn't sensationalized. It didn't need to be. The footage spoke for itself. By sunrise, every business blog, lifestyle page, and gossip outlet had picked it up. My face filled the headlines, alternating between admiration and controversy. Family feud in high heels. When the forgotten daughter takes the mic, and my personal favorite, the quietest power move of the year. I didn't read most of them, but I didn't have to. The silence of my phone the previous day had turned into a storm of opinions, and for once I didn't feel the need to control any of it. Marcus arrived at my suite just after 10. He knocked softly before letting himself in, carrying 2 cups of coffee and an expression that sat somewhere between awe and concern. "Morning," he said. "You've seen the news?" I nodded, hard to miss. He set the coffee down and pulled out his tablet. The clip's been shared 3 million times. Savannah Daily's website crashed twice overnight. They're calling it a cultural moment. I arched an eyebrow. A cultural moment. He smirked. "That's their phrase, not mine. Half the country seems to think you're a hero. The other half thinks you ruined a wedding." I took a slow sip of coffee. "They're both right." He hesitated, studying me. "The mayor called your father this morning. Told him to get a handle on the optics before it spreads to the political press. Apparently Lawson's worried about his re-election." "Of course he is," I said. "No one likes a scandal that doesn't belong to them." Marcus sighed. "The Bennetts have locked themselves in the presidential suite. Staff says they haven't checked out yet. Your sister took down all the photos from the ceremony." "Good," I said quietly. "She deserves a chance to start over without all that noise." He leaned against the table, crossing his arms. "And you? Do you want me to make a statement, or should we let the silence keep doing the work?" I looked at him for a long moment. "Let them talk," I said. "They'll say everything I don't need to." He nodded once. "Understood." When he left, the suite fell quiet again, except for the faint hum of the air conditioner. The city glowed beyond the window, the Savannah River cutting a silver path through the skyline. I poured myself a glass of wine from the minibar, not because I wanted to celebrate, but because I needed something to hold. It wasn't joy that filled me. Not triumph, either. Just stillness. For years I'd imagined what it would feel like to confront them, to make them see me finally without their filters or dismissals. But standing there in the aftermath, I realized recognition wasn't the same as peace. The truth was out. And yet all I felt was tired. My phone buzzed again. A text from Daniel Foster. "Daniel, you've officially solidified full ownership. No one can challenge your control now. Legal confirmation attached." I opened the file briefly, scanning the language. Dry, technical, final. I typed back, "Thank you." That's all I needed. Another message arrived almost immediately. "Daniel, they'll come around eventually. They always do once power shifts." I didn't reply. Some relationships couldn't be salvaged by leverage or time. Outside, the rain began to fall. Soft, hesitant drops tapping against the glass. The reflection of the city blurred, and in that blur, I saw a version of myself I didn't quite recognize. Calm, detached, no longer waiting for applause or apology. The television was still muted, playing a loop of coverage. I watched as Sarah Kim's face appeared on screen, her expression composed, her tone deliberate. In an age of noise and spectacle, she said, Claire Bennett's silence may be the most powerful statement of all. What unfolded last night wasn't a tantrum, it was a reckoning, a reminder that control isn't loud. Sometimes it simply walks into the room and everyone else stops talking. A slow, quiet breath escaped me. I hadn't expected understanding from anyone, least of all from the press, but Sarah's words settled somewhere deep, cutting through the numbness. I poured another inch of wine, watching the droplets trail down the glass. When the clip ended, the news ticker below the screen flashed updates. Public opinion overwhelmingly supports Bennett, viewed as emblem of self-worth and quiet strength. I let out a soft, humorless laugh. Quiet strength. That wasn't the story I'd written for myself, but it was the one they'd chosen to tell. My phone buzzed again. Marcus this time. Marcus' PR team says we should issue at least a minimal comment. I typed back quickly. No comment needed. Let silence finish the conversation. He replied with a single thumbs-up emoji before going offline. I set the phone aside and looked out at the city again, the lights reflecting off the water like tiny, stubborn stars. Everything had changed, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt like an ending. The kind that doesn't slam shut, but folds quietly over itself, leaving space for what might come next. I finished my wine and stood there for a long time, watching the storm roll over the Savannah skyline, thinking how strange it was that the loudest moment of my life had ended in perfect, deliberate quiet. Rain slid down the glass in slow streaks, turning the skyline into a watercolor blur. From the penthouse windows, New York looked distant, softened, almost kind. The city never really slept. But that morning, it felt quieter than usual, muted beneath the steady rhythm of rain. My phone buzzed again, vibrating against the marble counter like a restless insect. I didn't move to answer it. The screen lit up, filling with the same notifications that had been arriving for days. Missed calls, 89, voicemails too many to count, texts, emails, all from the same names I'd spent a lifetime waiting to hear from. And now I couldn't bring myself to touch a single one. I finally picked it up just long enough to read the top message. My mother, Claire. I'm sorry. I never thought it would go this far. Olivia hasn't stopped crying. Please call me. Her words were polite, even in apology, her tone familiar, measured, strategic, like she was negotiating peace rather than admitting guilt. For a moment, I imagined her sitting at the kitchen counter of their house in Boston, hands clasped around a mug of coffee, practicing the right phrasing before hitting send. I set the phone back down and reached for my leather-bound notebook. On a clean page, I wrote in small, steady letters, "Silence is not revenge. It's a boundary." The words looked calm, but I felt their weight settle deep inside me. I'd spent so much of my life responding, defending, explaining, proving. Now, for the first time, I didn't need to. Their silence had once made me invisible. Mine now made me free. The phone buzzed again. Grace. I answered on the third ring. Her voice was warm, carrying that mix of maternal concern and steel-edged honesty I'd come to rely on. "Morning, Claire. You sound awake, but not rested." I let out a soft laugh. "You can tell from 3 words I can tell from 30 years, she said. "How are you holding up?" "I'm fine." I looked around the apartment. The untouched breakfast tray, the open laptop, the half-empty glass of water on the nightstand. They've been calling non-stop, but I'm not angry anymore. Grace didn't respond immediately. "Not angry," she repeated like she was testing the phrase. "Then what are you done?" I said simply. There was a pause. "That's not the same thing as peace. I know," I admitted, "but it's close enough for now." Grace sighed. "You know they'll try to rewrite this story. People like your parents always do. Give it a few months, and you'll be the one who made a scene, not the one who was erased." I smiled faintly. "Then let them write their version." "I already own the building where they told that lie," she chuckled softly. "Fair enough. Still don't forget to rest. Power looks different when you're exhausted." "I'll be okay," I said, glancing out the window at the rain. For once, the quiet feels right. When we hung up, the apartment filled again with the low hum of the city outside. Car tires on wet pavement, a distant siren, the whisper of wind against glass. I picked up my phone again, not to respond, just to scroll. the same names repeated over and over. Mom, Dad, Aunt Margaret, a cousin I hadn't spoken to since college, and then one I didn't expect, Olivia. Her message was short. I didn't know Claire. Not about the hotel. Not about anything. I just wish we could talk. Please. I stared at the words until they blurred. I wanted to believe her. Part of me did. But another part, the one that had learned the cost of forgiveness too early, told me to wait. I set the phone down again and walked to the window. The rain had thickened soft gray curtains falling over the city. Far below, people hurried with umbrellas, small bursts of color against the concrete. It struck me then how small every storm looked from above. For years I'd imagined the confrontation differently. Louder, final, cinematic. I thought their apology would change something fundamental, that validation would fill the hollow space where belonging used to live. But it hadn't. The apology had come, and I felt nothing but stillness, because what I wanted wasn't regret. It was respect. And that I'd already given myself. I reached for the balcony door, pushing it open. Cool air met my skin, carrying the faint scent of wet asphalt and spring. I stepped outside barefoot, the rain misting against my face, the city humming below like a living heartbeat. For a long while I stood there watching the traffic lights change colors in the fog. Somewhere behind me the phone buzzed again, persistent and pleading, but I let it go unanswered. My reflection shimmered faintly in the glass framed by the skyline. Strong, composed, alone. And somewhere in the quiet, a voice in my head, steady and certain, whispered the truth. I'd been circling for years. I am not looking for an apology. I am looking for peace. The rain kept falling, gentle, relentless, washing the city clean. Spring had returned to California with the soft kind of light that made everything look like forgiveness. From the terrace of the new Bennett Napa resort, the vineyards stretched for miles. Rows of green and gold catching the morning sun like quiet applause. Cameras flashed in the courtyard below as the ribbon ceremony began. Reporters called out my name, the sound mixing with the click of champagne glasses and the hum of conversation. I stood in front of the glass entrance, scissors in hand, the satin ribbon glinting in front of me. To new beginnings, I said simply, before cutting it cleanly in half. The crowd erupted into applause. Flashbulbs sparked like stars. A journalist from Forbes shouted a question over the noise. Ms. Bennett, how does it feel to be called the woman redefining success in American hospitality? I smiled, the kind of smile that didn't need to be rehearsed. Success isn't about proving someone wrong, I said. It's about creating something right. Applause again, more cameras. My assistant guided me through a round of photos, a few interviews and a toast with investors who spoke in numbers but looked at me like a headline come to life. By early afternoon, the crowd began to disperse. The noise faded. The champagne lost its fizz. I returned to my suite, overlooking the vineyards, floor to ceiling, glass, soft oak, white lilies in every corner. The kind of serenity you could build when you'd already survived the chaos. A knock on the door. Marcus stepped in still in his dark suit from the ceremony, holding a bouquet so large it looked like it had been designed to fill silence. Deep purple tulips, wildflowers, and pale roses. Another gift from the press, I asked. He shook his head, handing it to me. Not this one. A white card peeked out from the stems. I recognized the handwriting before I even touched it, looped open careful. For my sister who taught me strength, Olivia. My throat tightened. I traced the words with my fingertips, the ink slightly smudged, as if she'd written it in a hurry. I hadn't seen her since that night in Savannah. We'd exchanged a few brief messages since small bridges built without ceremony. But this was different. She's coming to the gala tonight, Marcus said quietly. You'll both be at the head table. Do you want me to? I shook my head. No assigned seats this time. We'll all sit wherever we land. He smiled faintly. Symbolic. Intentional. I corrected, setting the card on the table beside a vase of lilies. The afternoon slipped into gold. Outside, the vineyards glowed beneath the setting sun, each grapevine lined with soft white lanterns for the evening celebration. Staff moved like clockwork, setting tables, adjusting lighting, preparing for guests who would soon arrive to toast the newest jewel in the Bennett empire. I stepped out onto the balcony, the air crisp with the scent of lavender and spring. From up here, I could hear faint laughter from the courtyard below. Marcus directing last-minute preparations, glasses clinking, the low murmur of success being measured. But my mind wasn't on the guests. It drifted to the photograph I'd placed in my suitcase that morning, a picture I hadn't looked at in years. 2 girls in the backyard of our old Boston home, barefoot in the grass, sunlight tangled in their hair. I'd found it tucked in the back of a drawer the week before, still faintly smelling of old paper and summers that no longer existed. I pulled it out now, the edges slightly worn, and held it against the light. For a long time I'd thought of that image as a wound, a reminder of what I'd lost, but tonight it felt like something else entirely. A beginning I'd finally learned how to finish. As the last sliver of sun disappeared behind the hills, the vineyard lights flickered on. Warm, amber glow spilled across the valley, catching the glass walls of the resort and turning them into mirrors. In my reflection I looked calm, older maybe, but at peace. A knock interrupted the quiet, Marcus again leaning in through the doorway. "They're ready for you downstairs." And Olivia just arrived. I exhaled slowly. "Good," I said. "It's time." He smiled. "No speeches tonight." I shook my head. No speeches, just dinner. As he left, I looked out once more at the horizon where the last light met the dark. My reflection blurred against the window, merging with the vineyards below. Past and present folded together. I whispered more to myself than to anyone else. They once told me there was no place for me, but that wasn't my fault. My voice was steady now, not bitter, not sad, just true. I didn't lose my seat. I continued quietly. I built another table, bigger, stronger, and wide enough for those who actually belong. The vineyard lights shimmered in the glass like a constellation, finally in order. As I turned to leave for the celebration, I felt the weight of the last year lift, replaced by something quieter, deeper. Peace earned the hard way. And if anyone ever asked me again what success really looked like, I would tell them this moment. The calm after the storm, the soft hum of laughter beneath the lights, the stillness of knowing I no longer needed to be seen to be certain of who I was. If you've ever been written out of your own story, remember this: you can always write it again, with your name shining on the sign outside.